Hello and welcome to the Confessions of a Yarn Addict podcast. My name is Anniken and I live in the southwest of England. I'm actually filming this on a really hot day in August. Just finished knitting this shawl and I wanted to do a yarn review before I send it off to the magazine. But this is actually being filmed a few months before it'll actually be released, which feels a bit strange, but this is the shawl. I will give you a closer look at that in a minute. So this is Noro, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, Tsubame, Tsubame. I will put the details of the yarn below. I'm just going to fold this back up again. And it's not a yarn I have actually knitted with before. So the yarn is 50% silk, 25% wool and 25% polyamide, which is a nylon. It's 200 grams, 200 gram ball, and it's got 600 meters. So it's about a DK weight. It actually feels slightly thicker than a DK yarn to me. It feels more like the American worsted, which is, to me, is, I would say worsted. I know a lot of people say worsted is the same as DK. I would say it's between a DK and an Aran weight in British terms. This yarn was sent to me by the Knitter magazine to design a shawl. They were sending me a surprise parcel of yarn, which I love. And then I get to design shawls with it. When the yarn arrived, I decided that I wanted to knit this shawl myself. I do use sample knitters for some of my samples because I just don't have time to knit them all myself, so I do use sample knitters. But I decided I really wanted to knit this one myself because I really want to try the yarn. I haven't knitted with Noro for a few years. I used to knit with a lot of Noro yarns when I first got back into knitting. Probably nearly 15 years ago now, quite a while ago now. So I used to knit with a lot of Noro yarns back then, but I haven't knitted with Noro for a few years. So I was quite excited when I opened the parcel and saw this Noro yarn. So the yarn, so as I said, it's a 200 gram ball, so it's quite a big ball, which doesn't make it very portable when it comes to taking your knitting out and about with you, unless you wind it into, say, 200 gram balls. Even if you actually rewind the yarn, the whole ball, it will make it smaller because the ball is quite kind of puffed out, quite a lot of air in it. I didn't actually take a picture of the ball when it arrived, and obviously I've knitted it up, so I don't have the ball here, but it's got 600 meters per 200 gram ball. And I wanted to make the most of the yarn I had, which is what dictated the choice of shawl shape that I decided to go for, because I wanted to try and make the most of the yarn I had. I always feel that Noro, and I'll give you a closer look at the shawl in a minute, but I always feel like Noro is kind of like the Marmite of yarns. So if you don't live in the UK, then that probably won't make any sense. But knitters seem to either love or hate Noro. Which is the same thing with Marmite. By the way, if you're not in the UK, Marmite is a spread that you spread on toast or bread, and it's dark brown, nearly black. And when I first moved to the UK, I actually thought it was chocolate spread. It tastes nothing like chocolate spread. Yeah, be careful if you come to the UK and you get the tasty Marmite, spread it very thinly. I'm not a fan of it, to be quite honest. But Marmite is the kind of thing that people either love or hate. I hate it. And I feel like Noro is a little bit the same. People seem to either love or hate it. I always like Noro, but I don't like all their yarns. I have knitted with some Noro yarns that I really loved. I've knitted with some Noro yarns that I haven't really liked that much. But this yarn I really, really like, by the way. So Noro is a singles yarn, which means that it's a single strand that's spun into yarn. Now most yarns are made up of applied yarn, which means that you have several different strands that are spun together to make what's called applied yarn. I'm not going to go into details about the advantages and disadvantages of applied versus a singles yarn, but Noro is a singles yarn, which means that some singles yarn aren't as balanced as applied yarns. Basically, when you, at least from hand spinning point of view, when you spin a yarn, you spin the first strand in one direction, and then when you apply two strands together, you go in the opposite direction, and that makes it a balanced yarn. And because you don't do that with singles yarns, it can make them a little bit unbalanced. And I'm really sorry when I move around, the light is a bit funny in here. So I do apologize if I suddenly, it looks like the light switches off. It doesn't, it's just when I move around, the light kind of changes. I don't know why. So Noro is a singles yarn, which means it's just one strand. The yarn is, so some yarns are dyed in the fleece. So the fleece is, the raw fleece is dyed, and then it's spun, mixed so then it's mixed as it's spun to create different colors. I'm assuming that's how Noro is spun. It looks like it's because of the way the texture and the different kind of colors. It's got kind of like, let me see if you can see it. You can probably see it better when I show you the whole shawl, but I don't know, you can see like specks of pink in here. So I think it's dyed in the fleece. So you got the fleece that's dyed, or the top is probably combed into top before it's dyed. And then they take different colors and spin them, mix the colors together as they're spinning it. What I did say was singles yarn can appear a little bit unbalanced. This actually does appear quite nice and balanced when you knit it into stocking stitch. If you knit a unbalanced yarn into stocking stitch, you sometimes get it like leaning left or right. But this looks quite nice and balanced, and it does have quite a nice stitch definition in stocking stitch, even though it's quite a textured yarn. So it's not going to have like perfectly even stitch definition, but it does actually have quite nice stitch definition. I haven't actually blocked this one or pressed it or anything. I just knitted it up quickly this morning with my tiny bit of leftover yarn. But I quite like the texture and the stitch definition in stocking stitch. It's quite the yarn has a lot of texture and character. It's quite a rustic yarn, which some knitters love, some knitters don't. But it's worth bearing in mind of the rustic nature on this yarn when choosing a pattern. So it may not suit all patterns. It's very soft, which is probably due to the 50% silk content. A lot of yarns that have silk have a sort of slight sheen to it. Depending on how much silk is in it, it can go from a very high sheen to just a very soft sheen. This doesn't have a sheen to it at all. It's a very matte yarn, which I'm assuming is because of the way it's spun. But it is very, very soft. The yarn also has lovely drape. So I knitted the shawl in garter stitch because I felt like that went better with the texture and the rusticness of the yarn. I actually chose a very simple stitch pattern, just garter stitch with a few cross stitches and like a scalloped picot edging all the way around two sides. I wanted to, because the colours were so beautiful, I wanted to really make the colours the focus of the shawl. So I wanted to, the colours and the texture, I wanted that to really stand out. And to do that, I decided to do garter stitch with a elongated cross stitch pattern and some picots, and I'm really pleased with the result, and I just hope that the editor likes it as well. So normally, so I had one skein. The recommended needle size is 3.5, hang on, let me check, 3.5 to 4 millimeter needles, which is about standard for DK yarn, even though I did say earlier that to me feels slightly thicker than a DK. I actually knitted a shawl on 5.5 millimeter needles, which is US 9. So the recommended needle size is 3.5 millimeter, which is US 4, size 4, to 4 millimeter, which is US size 6, and I knitted it on 5.5 millimeter, which is US size 9. The stocking stitch swatch I knitted on 4.5 millimeter. I actually thought it was 4 millimeter, but it was a bit early in the morning and I didn't read it properly. So 4.5 millimeter, which is US size 7. And the stocking stitch swatch still has lovely drape, even though I knitted it on a smaller needle size. And like I said earlier, really nice stitch definition considering the rustic nature of the yarn. I decided to make the most of this 200-gram skein of shawl, of yarn. To make the most of this 200-gram skein of yarn, I decided I would knit it on 5.5 millimeter needles. I rarely knit on needles that thick, so that was quite interesting. I rarely go above 5 millimeter. and I really enjoyed knitting it. It knitted up quickly because of the needle size, and because it was so easy. So it's been a really nice relaxing thing to knit, and it has really nice drapes. I wanted to make the most of the amount of yarn I had available and use as much of it as possible. So normally when I knit shawls, I allow about a 10% safety margin when it comes to yarn usage. So that means that I try and have about 10% of the yarn left, because I know that not everyone will knit it to the correct tension, and if you knit it to a different tension, you may need more yarn. And even if you knit it the correct tension, sometimes you may still need more yarn. So I normally allow about 10%, which means that I should have had 20 grams of yarn left. But because I wanted to make the most of this, the amount of yarn I had, and make the shawl big enough so it could be wrapped around your neck, I actually only had 10 grams left, which is probably a little bit not quite enough. I would like a slightly bigger safety margin, really. So I think this will knit up nicely in different stitch patterns. I've only knitted it in garter stitch, this elongated cross stitch pattern, which you'll see in a minute, and stocking stitch. So I haven't tried to knit it in cables or lace, mainly because I haven't got that much yarn left, so I don't have enough yarn left to do that. But I think it would knit up nicely in a variety of stitch patterns, so long as you bear in mind the kind of texture and the rustic nature of the yarn. I do recommend swatching before you decide whether to use this yarn or not, especially if you're using a pattern that doesn't recommend a Noro yarn. So if you're using a pattern that was not knitted up in this yarn, say was knitted up in a smooth DK yarn like this, a completely smooth DK merino wool yarn, you will get a very different look if you knit it in a Noro yarn. So bear that in mind. I think this would be suitable for a shawl. Obviously that's what I've knitted in it, or other accessories like a hat, warm sweater or cardigan. Bearing in mind that it is quite a thick yarn and does have wool in it, so I think it'd be quite a warm yarn. Because it's not a plied yarn, it may not be super hard wearing. And also because it's a plied yarn, it also doesn't have the elasticity that a plied yarn often has. So a friend of mine knitted a pair of hand warmers in Noro years ago, and it stretched out of shape a little bit, and she wasn't very happy with that. But that's the kind of the yarn. If you have silk, it'll stretch and keep its shape better, which is ideal for shawls. But it's not so ideal for, say, hand warmers, because you want them to fit your hand, and they basically stretched and ended up a bit baggy on her. So I would say that that's something that you probably want to bear in mind if you're going to use this yarn. Also, I don't think it's that hard wearing for hand warmers. So I personally wouldn't use it for my hands or my feet. I would use it for a hat, but I would make sure I did a rib at the bottom to make sure that it fits snugly, even if you wanted a little bit kind of looser at the top. I think it'd also be nice for like a beret or something, and sweaters, cardigans, shawls, perfect for that kind of thing. But if you need a little bit of elasticity in the pattern, just do a rib or something, and that will give you that elasticity. I can't say that word this morning. But yeah, I really enjoyed knitting with this, and I would definitely use this yarn again. So I'm going to leave you with a little look at the shawl. I spread it out on my bed so you can see the colour progression, and where I tell you a little bit about the shawl and a little bit about the yarn. And I may have said a few things that I've said in this clip as well, so I apologise if I'm repeating myself. But I hope you like it. Tell me whether you've knitted with this yarn. I will type the details, put the details of the yarn below. Let me know if you've knitted with this yarn, what you think of it, what you think of Noro in general, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. So I've spread this shawl out on my bed just so you can get a good look at the colours. So it starts up in that corner there with just a few stitches, and then it's increased along the top edge, so along here all the way along. There's some picots along this edge, and then it's cast off along here with some different picots. Actually, probably wouldn't call these picots scallops. You just cast off 2 stitches at the beginning of row 6. So you can see the colours in this shawl is beautiful. The colour repeats are fairly short, even at the beginning when there are fewer stitches. the color repeats aren't that many rows. Then obviously they get shorter and shorter as we come through the shawl, because stitch count increases. So the stitch count increases by 4 stitches for every 6 rows. But I do really like the colors of this shawl, and I think that's one of the things that Noro do best, is their colors. Love the pinks and the lilacs and the lavenders and the greens. There's a little bit of brown, some spots of yellow, so I really like that. This is knitted in garter stitch on 5.5mm needles. The recommended needle size is 3.5 to 4mm, so this is knitted at a looser gauge. I only had one ball, and I wanted to try and make the shawl as big as I could. It's a 200-gram ball and 600 meters, so I want to try and make the shawl as big as I could, and that also helped to dictate the shape. Because Noro yarn is slightly textured, I would say it has a lot of character. I'm actually showing you the wrong side of this shawl now, but it doesn't really matter because it's in garter stitch, so it's not a huge difference between the right and wrong side. It's got a lot of texture to it. The way it's spun, a lot of people think is a little bit rough. A lot of people don't, a lot of hand spinners aren't that keen on it. I think Noro seems to be, if you're in the UK, you will have heard, you will obviously know about Marmite. If you're not in the UK, you may not know what Marmite is, but it's a spread you spread on toast and bread, and it's, people either love it or hate it. And I would say that Noro is a little bit like the Marmite of yarns. People seem to either love it or hate it. I got friends who hate it, I got friends who love it. Got one friend, most of what she knits is actually Noro. And that's because of the colours and the texture, but it is quite textured, quite rustic, I would say. I had one friend who's a hand spinner tell me once that if she hand spun a yarn like that, like Noro, she wouldn't be happy with it. So I think it depends on what you like. You're not going to get a completely smooth, even fabric with it because it's not that kind of yarn. So because I did this in garter stitch, excuse me, I've actually just knitted a small piece in stocking stitch. I've actually cast it off because I wanted to use a little bit of yarn I had left for a design swatch for a magazine submission. As usual, what I do with leftover yarn. So I just knitted a few rows in stocking stitch using 4.5mm needles. I actually thought I'd grab my 4mm needles, but it was a little bit dark and my eyesight is not as good as it used to be, so I got it wrong. So you can see even in stocking stitch, you can still see that texture. You can see the little flecks of yarn, of other colors, sorry. You can see these little specks of other colors, and you can still see that it's got that sort of texture and rustic charm about it, which a lot of people like and a lot of people don't like. But the colors are adoring. I love the colors.